In Madison County, this stretch of road used to lead to the Dixon place, a quiet farm, until the spring of 1887 when Elijah Dixon was accused of murder. The trial lasted 2 days, the verdict less than an hour. He was
Mountain Phantom. The Dixon brothers slaughtered 20 lawmen who hanged their father in front of town. The deadliest act of filial vengeance in American history and the most relentless campaign of retribution the Virginia mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of the Dixon brothers. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Wise County, Virginia, known simply as the Backcountry. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into rifle fire. Hemmed in by the ancient Appalachian Mountains, the early settlers who lived along the Powell River and its countless tributaries were cut off from the outside world. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation remained that way. There were no telephones and the roads were few and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most lawless and unforgiving sections in all of America. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up until the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This, no doubt, has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. And during the 1800s, and even well into the 1900s, most of the region's inhabitants were farmers and hunters who lived a simple existence. Most of them lived in log cabins, surviving by working the thin mountain soil and hunting the game that still roamed freely through the forests. Schools and churches were few and far between. In fact, most children didn't even attend school, and those that did rarely did so for more than just a few months a year. You see, in these mountains, a man's honor was everything. It was the currency by which he was measured, the foundation upon which his family's standing rested, the legacy he would pass on to his children. A man's word was his bond, and breaking that bond was a sin worse than murder in the eyes of the community. To be called a liar or a thief was to be cast out from decent society, to be marked as someone whose word meant nothing and whose handshake was worthless, and to be publicly humiliated, to be stripped of honor before the eyes of one's neighbors, was a wound that could never heal, and that demanded blood payment from those responsible. The Dixon family had lived in Wise County since the late 1700s, their ancestors among the first white settlers to push through the Cumberland Gap and establish homesteads in the wilderness beyond. They had carved out a living in a hollow at the head of Guest River, a remote and beautiful place where the mountains rose steep on all sides and where a man could live his entire life without seeing a stranger. For 4 generations, the Dixons had worked that land, improving it slowly through back-breaking labor, passing it down from father to son as the most precious inheritance imaginable. By 1895, the Dixon homestead encompassed over 1,000 acres of mountain land, making the family one of the most substantial in the county. That's right, the patriarch of the Dixon family in 1895 was a man named Ezekiel Dixon, known to everyone simply as Old Zeke. He was 61 years old that year, a weathered giant of a man who had spent his entire life working the land and raising the 7 children his wife Mary had given him before her death in 1882. Zeke was respected throughout the county as a man of his word, a fair dealer, and a formidable enemy when crossed. He had fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side, had survived wounds that would have killed lesser men, and had returned to the mountains to rebuild a life that the war had nearly destroyed. His word was law within his family, and his reputation in the broader community was beyond reproach. The homestead that Zeke had built over his lifetime was a testament to what a man could accomplish through honest labor and careful stewardship. The main cabin was a 2-story structure, built from logs that Zeke and his father had cut from the surrounding forest, chinked with clay from the riverbank, and roofed with hand-split shingles that kept out even the heaviest mountain rains. Behind the cabin stood a barn large enough to shelter a dozen cattle and twice that many hogs. Built over the course of 3 summers by Zeke and his growing sons, there was a smokehouse, a springhouse, a blacksmith shop, and half a dozen other outbuildings that made the homestead virtually self-sufficient. The land itself was a patchwork of cleared fields and managed forest, each section serving its purpose in the complex economy of mountain farming. The bottomland along the creek produced corn and vegetables for the family's table and feed for the livestock. The hillsides provided pasture for cattle that were prized throughout the region for their hardiness and their meat. The forested sections yielded timber for building and firewood for heating, as well as game that supplemented the family's diet through the long mountain winters. Every acre had been improved through generations of labor, and every improvement added to the value of what the Dixons would pass on to their children. Among Zeke's 7 children, 5 were sons, and those 5 sons would become the instruments of a vengeance so complete and so terrible that their names would be spoken with fear for generations. The eldest was Elijah, born in 1862, a man who had inherited his father's size and strength and who was known as the most dangerous fighter in the county. Elijah stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 240 pounds, all of it muscle earned through a lifetime of hard labor. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's coal-black hair, and he moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Men who had seen him fight spoke of it with something approaching awe, describing a controlled ferocity that overwhelmed opponents before they could mount any effective defense. Then came Isaac in 1864, quieter than his brother, but equally formidable, a man who preferred to think before he acted, but who acted with devastating effect when the time came. Isaac was the marksman of the family, able to hit targets at distances that other men would consider impossible. He had learned to shoot from his father, who had been a sharpshooter during the war, and he had spent countless hours perfecting his craft until he could drop a running deer at 300 yards or split a playing card edge on at 50 feet. His patience was legendary, his concentration unbreakable once he had focused on a target. Thomas was born in 1867, the most sociable of the brothers, able to charm strangers and negotiate disputes with a skill that his more taciturn siblings lacked. He had inherited his mother's quick smile and easy manner, and he could make friends in any company within minutes of arrival. But beneath the charm was a calculating intelligence that missed nothing and forgot nothing. Thomas gathered information the way other men gathered firewood, constantly and almost unconsciously, building a picture of the world around him that he could draw upon when needed. He was the eyes and ears of the family, the one who knew what was happening throughout the county and beyond. William came in 1870, a steady and reliable man who lacked the exceptional qualities of his older brothers, but who made up for it with sheer determination and endurance. He was the one who kept things running, who handled the daily chores and the routine tasks that made the homestead function. He could work from dawn to dusk without complaint, could push through exhaustion and pain that would stop other men, could be counted on absolutely to do whatever was asked of him. His brothers called him the Mule, affectionately, acknowledging both his stubbornness and his strength. And Samuel in 1873, the youngest, completing the band of brothers who would make the Dixon name infamous. Samuel was the quickest of the brothers, both in body and in mind. He could outrun any man in the county over any distance, could climb trees and scramble over rocks with the agility of a squirrel, could squeeze through gaps that seemed too narrow for a child. He was also the best tracker of the 5, able to follow a trail through terrain that revealed nothing to other eyes. Where his brothers saw only leaves and stones, Samuel saw stories written in broken twigs and displaced pebbles. The trouble that would destroy the Dixon family and set in motion one of the bloodiest vendettas in American history began with something as simple as a property line. A man named Harrison Crawford had purchased land adjoining the Dixon homestead in 1893, and almost immediately disputes arose about where exactly the boundary lay. Crawford claimed that the Dixons were grazing cattle on his property and cutting timber from his land. The Dixons insisted that the boundary had been established generations ago and that Crawford was trying to steal land that had been theirs since before his grandfather was born. The dispute festered for 2 years, growing more bitter with each passing month. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand who Harrison Crawford was and why he posed such a threat to the Dixon family. That's right. Crawford was not a native of Wise County, but an outsider who had come to the mountains seeking opportunity in the coal industry that was transforming the region. He had made his fortune by buying up mineral rights throughout southwestern Virginia, often from families who did not understand what they were selling or what the land beneath their feet was worth. By 1893, Crawford controlled more coal than any other individual in the county, and his wealth had purchased political influence that extended all the way to Richmond. Crawford's business methods were ruthless and often illegal, though his political connections ensured that he was never held accountable for his actions. He had driven competitors out of business through price manipulation and outright sabotage. He had crushed labor organizing through violence and intimidation. He had bribed judges and legislators to ensure that the law would always be on his side. For Harrison Crawford, the world was divided into those who served his interests and those who stood in his way, and the latter category was one he worked constantly to eliminate. The Dixon family represented everything that Crawford despised about the mountain communities he was exploiting. They were independent and self-sufficient, owing nothing to anyone and asking nothing in return. They controlled land that Crawford wanted, land that contained coal deposits that could make him even wealthier than he already was, and they refused to be intimidated, refused to sell, refused to bow to the kind of pressure that had broken so many other families. Old Zeke Dixon had looked Crawford in the eye and told him that the land was not for sale at any price. Dan Crawford had never forgiven the insult. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of money and influence, and he saw the Dixon family as merely another obstacle to be overcome. When his initial legal challenges to the boundary failed, he decided to try a different approach. The county sheriff in 1895 was a man named Thomas Blackwood, a Crawford ally who had been elected with the coalman's money and who owed his position to Crawford's political connections. Blackwood was not particularly competent as a lawman, but he was reliably corrupt, willing to use his authority in whatever way his benefactors required. When Crawford came to him with a proposal to deal with the Dixon problem, Blackwood listened carefully and agreed to help. The plan they developed would require patience and careful execution, but if it succeeded, the Dixons would be destroyed and Crawford would have everything he wanted. The first step was to manufacture a crime that could be attributed to old Zeke Dixon, something serious enough to justify extreme punishment, but not so implausible that the community would question it. Crawford and Blackwood settled on cattle theft, a charge that was taken seriously in any agricultural community and that carried harsh penalties under Virginia law. They arranged for several head of cattle bearing Crawford's brand to be found on Dixon property, placed there by Crawford's own men in the dead of night. When the cattle were discovered, Blackwood had the pretext he needed to arrest the most respected man in the county. The arrest of Ezekiel Dixon sent shockwaves through Wise County. No one who knew the old man believed for a moment that he was capable of stealing cattle or anything else. He had built his reputation over 6 decades of honest dealing, and the idea that he would risk everything for a few head of livestock was absurd on its face. But the evidence was there. The cattle had been found on his property, and Blackwood insisted that the law had to take its course. Zeke was taken to the county jail in the town of Big Stone Gap, where he would await trial on charges that everyone knew were false. The Dixon brothers immediately began working to free their father, hiring the best lawyer in the region and gathering witnesses who could testify to Zeke's character and the impossibility of the charges against him. They were confident that no jury of their neighbors would convict a man they all knew to be innocent. That justice would prevail despite Crawford's machinations. What they did not understand was how thoroughly Crawford had corrupted the system, how completely he had purchased the loyalty of the men who would decide their father's fate. And that's when things got ugly, because Thomas Blackwood and Harrison Crawford had already decided that Ezekiel Dixon would never see the inside of a courtroom. You see, the plan that Crawford and Blackwood had developed went far beyond a simple trial. They understood that even with their influence, a conviction was not guaranteed. The evidence was thin, the community's sympathy was with the accused, and the Dixon brothers were working diligently to expose the frame-up. What Crawford needed was not a conviction, but a permanent solution, something that would eliminate old Zeke and send a message to anyone else who might consider challenging Crawford's authority in the region. The solution they settled on was as old as the mountains themselves, a lynching dressed up in the clothes of legal process. Blackwood would convene a special session of the county court, stacked with judges who owed their positions to Crawford's money. The trial would be conducted with sufficient formality to maintain appearances, but the verdict was already determined. and the sentence would be death by hanging, carried out immediately in the public square of Big Stone Gap, before the Dixon brothers could organize any response. Speed and surprise were essential to the plan's success. The so-called trial of Ezekiel Dixon took place on a cold November morning in 1895, conducted with such haste that the defense attorney only learned of it an hour before it began. The Dixon brothers were not notified at all, a deliberate omission that ensured they would not be present to disrupt the proceedings. 3 judges sat on the bench, all of them Crawford men, and they listened with barely concealed impatience as the prosecution presented its manufactured evidence. The defense attorney objected repeatedly, but his objections were overruled without consideration. The outcome was never in doubt. The courtroom was packed with Crawford employees and supporters who had been brought in to create the appearance of public interest in the proceedings. They filled the benches and lined the walls, their presence designed to intimidate anyone who might consider speaking up in Zeke's defense. The few genuine citizens who had come to witness the trial found themselves squeezed into corners, their protests drowned out by the murmuring of the crowd whenever the defense attorney tried to make a point. The prosecution presented its case with the confidence of men who knew the verdict was predetermined. They called witnesses who swore they had seen Zeke near Crawford's cattle in the days before the theft was discovered. Witnesses who were Crawford employees with obvious motives to lie. They introduced the testimony of the men who had discovered the cattle on Dixon property, men who neglected to mention that they had placed the animals there themselves the night before. The evidence was thin and obviously manufactured, but the judges accepted it without question. The defense attorney, a young man named Jonathan Carter, who had taken the case out of genuine belief in Zeke's innocence, did his best with an impossible situation. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the witnesses' testimony, the lack of any motive for a man of Zeke's means to steal a few head of cattle, the convenient timing of the discovery just when Crawford needed a pretext to move against the Dixons. But his arguments fell on deaf ears. The judges were not interested in evidence or logic. They were interested in pleasing the man who paid them. The guilty verdict was delivered within an hour of the trial's commencement, and the sentence was pronounced immediately thereafter, death by hanging, to be carried out at noon that very day in the public square. Old Zeke received the news with the dignity that had characterized his entire life, standing straight and refusing to show fear before his enemies. He asked only that word be sent to his sons, that they might know what had happened and why. Blackwood agreed to this request, though he had no intention of honoring it. The sons would learn of their father's death after it was too late to prevent it. The hanging of Ezekiel Dixon was designed to be a spectacle, a demonstration of Crawford's power, and a warning to anyone who might consider opposing him. Word was spread through the town that a cattle thief would be executed at noon, and a crowd began to gather in the square. Most of those present were Crawford employees or people who depended on his patronage, though a few curious townspeople joined them. A gallows had been hastily constructed in the center of the square, a crude wooden platform with a crossbeam, and a rope that swayed slightly in the cold wind. They brought old Zeke out at precisely noon, his hands bound behind his back and a guard on each side. He walked with his head high, refusing the hood that was offered, wanting his face to be visible to everyone present. The crowd fell silent as he climbed the steps to the gallows, impressed despite themselves by the courage of this old man who faced death without flinching. Blackwood read the sentence in a voice that cracked slightly, perhaps aware at some level of the enormity of what he was doing. Then the noose was placed around Zeke's neck, and the trap door was released. The rope was too short, and Ezekiel Dixon did not die quickly. He strangled slowly, his body twisting and jerking for nearly 15 minutes while the crowd watched in horrified fascination. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight. Others watched with the grim satisfaction of people who believed they were witnessing justice. Blackwood stood at the edge of the platform, his face pale, clearly shaken by the brutality of what he had helped orchestrate. But he did not stop it, did not cut the rope, did not show mercy to a man who had been condemned by a process that was justice in name only. And less than a mile away, the Dixon brothers received word of what was happening from a sympathetic townsman who had risked everything to warn them. You see, the messenger reached the Dixon homestead just as the trial was concluding, riding through the mountains at breakneck speed, on a horse that was lathered with sweat by the time it arrived. He burst into the main cabin where the brothers had gathered to discuss their legal strategy, shouting that their father had been convicted and would be hanged within the hour. For a moment, the brothers stood frozen, unable to process what they were hearing. Then Elijah, the eldest, began issuing orders with a cold fury that his siblings had never heard from him before. They rode for Big Stone Gap at a gallop, 5 brothers on 5 horses, pushing their mounts to the edge of collapse. But the mathematics of distance and time were against them, and they knew it even as they rode. The town was over an hour away at the fastest pace, and the hanging was scheduled for noon. They might arrive in time to see their father die, might even arrive after he was already dead, but they could not possibly arrive in time to save him. This knowledge did not slow them down. They had to try, had to do something, had to be there, even if all they could do was bear witness. They arrived in Big Stone Gap just as Zeke's body was being cut down from the gallows, too late by perhaps 20 minutes to have made any difference. The crowd was already dispersing, people walking away with the uncomfortable silence of those who have witnessed something they would rather forget. The brothers pushed through this crowd, their horses scattering people who moved too slowly, until they reached the platform where their father's body lay covered by a rough blanket. Elijah dismounted and pulled the blanket back, looking down at the face of the man who had raised them, and something broke inside him that could never be repaired. The other brothers gathered around, each confronting in his own way the reality of what had been done to their father. Isaac's face went blank, all emotion draining away as if a door had been closed somewhere inside him. Thomas wept openly, tears streaming down his face as he knelt beside the body and took his father's still warm hand. William stood rigid with shock, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to speak but could not find words. Samuel, the youngest, turned away and vomited into the dust, his body rejecting what his eyes had seen. They were 5 men united by blood and by a grief that would transform them into something the world had rarely seen. Sheriff Blackwood approached them with the transparent intention of offering condolences, perhaps believing that the brothers would be too stunned to respond. He never finished his first sentence. Elijah drew his pistol and fired in a single fluid motion, the bullet striking Blackwood in the shoulder and spinning him around. The crowd scattered, screaming, as the other brothers drew their weapons and fired at anyone wearing a badge. In the chaos that followed, 3 deputies fell dead or dying, and Sheriff Blackwood himself was wounded twice more before he managed to crawl to cover behind a water trough. The Dixon brothers retreated from the town with their father's body, fighting their way through a cordon of hastily organized resistance that formed too late and too weakly to stop them. 2 more men died in the running battle that followed, townspeople who had the misfortune to be armed and visible when the brothers passed. By the time the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, the Dixon brothers had vanished into the mountains with old Zeke's corpse, and 7 men lay dead or wounded in the streets of Big Stone Gap. The vendetta had begun before the echoes of the execution had faded. That night, gathered in the main cabin of the Dixon homestead, with their father's body laid out on the kitchen table, where he had eaten his meals for 60 years, the brothers made a solemn vow. Every man who had participated in their father's murder would pay with his life. Every judge who had sat on the bench, every lawman who had arrested or guarded him, every witness who had testified falsely, every conspirator who had helped plan and execute this travesty of justice. The list was long, but the brothers had time and patience and a cold determination that nothing would shake. Before they were done, 20 men would die, and the name Dixon would become synonymous with vengeance throughout the Appalachian Mountains. And that vow, spoken over their father's body in the flickering light of oil lamps, would be fulfilled to the letter over the following 2 years. You see, the Dixon brothers didn't strike randomly or impulsively, despite their overwhelming grief and rage. That's right. They understood that emotion-driven violence would only get them killed before they could accomplish their purpose. Instead, they spent the weeks following their father's murder, gathering intelligence, compiling a complete list of everyone who had participated in the conspiracy, and developing plans for how each target would be eliminated. They buried old Zeke beside his wife on the hill overlooking the homestead, and they transformed their grief into something cold and systematic. The list they compiled eventually contained 23 names, though 3 of those men would die of natural causes before the brothers could reach them. At the top was Harrison Crawford himself, the man whose greed had started everything. Next came the 3 judges who had presided over the mockery of a trial. Then Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, who had survived the initial attack, but who remained on Dixon territory. The remaining names included deputies, false witnesses, and Crawford employees who had played various roles in the conspiracy. Each name was researched, each man's habits and vulnerabilities documented, each killing planned with care. The brothers divided responsibilities according to their individual skills. Elijah, as the eldest and the natural leader, coordinated overall strategy and made the final decisions about timing and methods. Isaac, the best shot among them, would handle killings that required precision at a distance. Thomas, with his ability to move easily in social situations, gathered intelligence and identified targets. William and Samuel, the youngest, served as scouts and messengers, moving through the county to monitor targets and report their positions. It was a division of labor that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their exposure to risk. The first killing came 3 weeks after old Zeke's hanging, on a moonless December night when Judge Ambrose Carrington was walking home from a Christmas gathering at a neighbor's house. Carrington had been the presiding judge at the trial, the one who had pronounced the death sentence with such obvious satisfaction. He was 63 years old, confident in his position, and utterly unprepared for the justice that caught up with him that night. His body was found the next morning at the edge of the road, shot once through the heart, a note pinned to his chest that read, "Justice for Ezekiel Dixon, one of many." The killing of Judge Carrington electrified the county and sent the surviving conspirators into a panic. Crawford immediately hired additional guards to protect his property and his person. The remaining 2 judges fled to Richmond, believing that distance would provide safety. Sheriff Blackwood, still recovering from his wounds, barricaded himself in the jail with what remained of his deputies and sent urgent requests for reinforcements to the state capital. The comfortable certainty that had characterized these men's lives was replaced by a constant, gnawing fear that the Dixon brothers could reach them anywhere. The second judge died 2 weeks later, shot through the window of the Richmond hotel where he had taken refuge. The precision of the shot demonstrated that distance was no protection from the Dixon brothers' vengeance. The third judge survived only slightly longer, killed in his own home despite the guards that surrounded it, his throat cut while he slept in the bed where he had felt safest. The notes left with each body continued the count, keeping careful track of the vendetta's progress. Justice for Ezekiel Dixon, 2 of many. And then 3. The pattern was established, and the terror began to spread beyond the immediate targets to encompass everyone associated with them. Servants quit their positions, refusing to work in houses that might be targeted. Deputies resigned their commissions, unwilling to risk their lives for a sheriff who had brought this catastrophe upon them. Even Crawford's mine workers grew restless, wondering if their employment made them targets in the Dixon brothers' war. The killing of 3 judges had destabilized the entire power structure of the region. Sheriff Blackwood was the 4th victim, killed in his own jail 3 months after the hanging he had orchestrated. The brothers had waited patiently for Blackwood to emerge from his fortifications, but when it became clear he would not, they found another way. A prisoner being held for minor offenses was convinced to create a distraction that drew the guards away from Blackwood's position. In the confusion that followed, Elijah Dixon slipped into the jail through a window that the guards had neglected to secure and found Blackwood hiding in a supply closet. The conversation between them was brief, and when it ended, Blackwood was dead with a bullet in his brain. The spring of 1896 saw the killings continue at an accelerating pace. Deputies who had participated in old Zeke's arrest were hunted down throughout the county and beyond. False witnesses who had testified at the trial were found dead in their homes, in their barns, on the roads they traveled. Crawford's most trusted employees, the men who had planted the stolen cattle on Dixon property, were eliminated one by one. Each killing was marked with a note. Each death added to the running count. By May, 12 men were dead, and the vendetta showed no signs of slowing. That's right. The state of Virginia responded to the crisis by deploying a company of militia to Wise County, over 100 armed men tasked with restoring order and capturing the Dixon brothers. They established checkpoints on every road, searched every building in Big Stone Gap and the surrounding towns, and offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to the brothers' arrest. But the militia found themselves operating in hostile territory, facing a population that saw the Dixons as heroes rather than criminals. Information flowed to the brothers, while the militia stumbled blind. The militia's task was complicated by the terrain they were asked to operate in. These were not open plains where cavalry could maneuver and infantry could march in formation. These were the Appalachian Mountains, a maze of ridges and hollows that had confounded armies since before the Revolution. The trails that connected one community to another were narrow and treacherous, easily blocked by a few determined men, easily watched from heights that the militia could not reach. Every advantage belonged to those who knew the land, and the Dixon brothers knew it better than anyone alive. The soldiers themselves were poorly suited for the mission they had been given. Most were city boys from Richmond and Norfolk, men who had never spent a night in the wilderness and who found the mountain conditions almost unbearable. They got lost on trails that locals navigated without thinking. They made noise that announced their presence for miles. They fell ill from drinking water that looked clean, but carried diseases their bodies had no defenses against. Within a month of their arrival, a third of the company was unfit for duty, and morale among the remainder had collapsed. The local population made the militia's job even harder. Mountain people who had no particular connection to the Dixon family nevertheless refused to cooperate with the soldiers, seeing in them representatives of the same distant authority that had murdered an innocent man on fabricated charges. Farmers who were asked about Dixon movements shrugged and said they had seen nothing. Merchants who were asked to report suspicious purchases smiled and said their customers' business was their own concern. The conspiracy of silence was virtually complete. The militia's presence did slow the pace of killings, but it did not stop them entirely. The Dixons adapted their tactics, striking when the soldiers were elsewhere, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to approach targets that the militia believed were protected. 2 more men died in June, killed in the same week, demonstrating that the vendetta would continue regardless of how many soldiers were deployed against it. The militia commander requested reinforcements and was denied. The state had other priorities, and the situation in Wise County was becoming an embarrassment. Harrison Crawford himself became increasingly desperate as the weeks passed and the list of victims grew longer. He had hired the best private guards money could buy, had fortified his mansion with the most modern security measures available, had taken to sleeping in a different room each night so that anyone who breached his defenses would not know where to find him. But he understood that none of these precautions could protect him forever, that the Dixon brothers had proven themselves capable of reaching anyone they targeted, and that his name was certainly on their list. In July, Crawford made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He would not wait to be hunted. He would take the fight to the Dixon brothers, would use his money and influence to organize an assault on the Dixon homestead that would end the vendetta once and for all. He gathered a force of 50 men, including militia soldiers, whose commanders had been bribed to look the other way, and he led them personally into the mountains toward the hollow where the Dixons had lived for 4 generations. Crawford had convinced himself that the Dixon brothers' success was due primarily to surprise and knowledge of terrain, advantages that a large, well-organized force could neutralize. He had studied military tactics in books, had imagined himself a strategist of considerable skill, and he believed that his plan would succeed where the militia had failed. He would approach the Dixon homestead from 3 directions simultaneously, cutting off any possibility of escape, and he would overwhelm the brothers with superior numbers before they could organize an effective defense. What Crawford did not understand was that the brothers had anticipated exactly this kind of attack and had prepared for it for months. They had established observation posts throughout the surrounding mountains, positions that provided early warning of any approaching force. They had prepared fighting positions that exploited every advantage the terrain could offer, positions that were invisible from below, but that provided clear fields of fire across the approaches to the hollow. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies, had developed signals that allowed them to communicate across distances, had rehearsed their response until every man knew exactly what to do. The first sign of Crawford's approach came from a lookout positioned on a ridge 3 miles from the homestead. He spotted the column moving along the trail from Big Stone Gap and immediately sent word to the brothers, who were waiting at the main cabin. Within an hour, every member of the Dixon family who could hold a rifle was in position, watching the trails that led into the hollow, waiting for the enemy to enter the killing ground that had been prepared for them. Crawford's force entered the hollow from the south, following a trail that seemed to offer easy access to the homestead. They moved in a column that stretched for nearly a quarter mile, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning the surrounding hillsides for any sign of ambush. But they saw nothing, because there was nothing to see. The Dixon positions were concealed so well that a man could have walked within 10 feet of them without knowing they were there. The brothers held their fire, waiting until the maximum number of enemies were within the kill zone. The Battle of Dixon Hollow, as it came to be known, lasted less than 2 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of Crawford's force. The brothers had been warned of the approaching column by their network of supporters and had prepared an ambush that exploited every advantage the terrain could offer. Crawford's men found themselves caught in a crossfire from positions they could not see, attacked from angles they had not anticipated, cut down before they could organize any effective response. Of the 50 men who entered the hollow, fewer than 15 emerged alive. The signal to open fire was given by Elijah, who watched from a position overlooking the center of the kill zone. When he saw that the majority of Crawford's force was within the prepared area, he raised his rifle and fired a single shot at the lead horseman. That shot was followed immediately by a volley from every other Dixon position, a storm of lead that tore through Crawford's column with devastating effect. Men fell from their horses, stumbled and collapsed on the trail, scrambled for cover that did not exist. The return fire from Crawford's men was wild and ineffective, aimed at muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared before they could draw a bead. Some men tried to charge up the hillsides toward the positions that were killing them, but they were cut down before they had climbed 10 feet. Others tried to retreat the way they had come, but they found the trail blocked by Samuel and William, who had circled behind the column during the night. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nothing to do but die. The battle's second phase began when the surviving members of Crawford's force managed to find temporary cover behind a rocky outcropping in the center of the hollow. They were pinned there by fire from multiple directions, unable to advance or retreat, slowly being picked off one by one as the Dixon marksmen found angles to reach them. Some tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands, but the brothers showed no mercy. They remembered their father strangling at the end of a rope, and they paid back that memory with interest. Crawford himself was among the last to die, having survived the initial ambush by pure luck, and having made his way to the rocky outcropping with a handful of his men. He tried to rally them, tried to organize some kind of defense or escape, but his commands were drowned out by the constant crack of rifle fire. He watched his men fall one by one, watched his grand plan dissolve into chaos and slaughter, and at last he understood that he had made a fatal miscalculation. His wealth and power meant nothing here. The mountains belonged to the Dixons. Harrison Crawford was among the dead, killed by a bullet that struck him between the eyes as he tried to rally his disintegrating force. His body was found after the battle, stripped of its fine clothes and valuables, a note pinned to his bare chest that marked him as the 15th victim of the vendetta. The man whose greed had started everything had finally paid the ultimate price, though his death did not end the brothers' campaign. There were still names on the list, men who had helped murder old Zeke and who had not yet faced justice, and the Dixons intended to cross off every name. You see, the destruction of Crawford's force created a brief window of opportunity for the Dixon brothers. The militia units that had been deployed to the county were withdrawn in disgrace, their commanders facing courts-martial for their involvement in the unauthorized attack. The political establishment in Richmond was too occupied with the scandal to organize an effective response, and the remaining men on the brothers' list found themselves suddenly without the protection they had relied on. The killings resumed in August and continued through the fall, a relentless campaign that eliminated every remaining conspirator the brothers could locate. Deputies who had fled to other counties were tracked down throughout Virginia and the surrounding states. False witnesses who had relocated to distant cities were found and punished. Men who had played minor roles in the conspiracy, roles so small that they had believed themselves safe, learned that the Dixon brothers forgot nothing and forgave nothing. Each killing demonstrated the reach and determination of the vendetta. The methods the brothers used varied according to the circumstances of each target. Some were killed from a distance, Isaac demonstrating his legendary marksmanship by dropping targets at ranges that seemed impossible. Others were approached directly, confronted by Thomas or Elijah, and given a moment to understand why they were about to die before the sentence was carried out. A few were taken alive and questioned, forced to reveal information about the locations of other conspirators before being executed. Every killing was professional and efficient, the work of men who had turned vengeance into a craft. The network of support that sustained the brothers extended far beyond Wise County. Mountain families throughout southwestern Virginia and eastern Kentucky had heard the story of old Zeke and the corrupt trial that had led to his murder. Many of them had experienced similar injustices at the hands of coal operators and their purchased politicians, and they saw in the Dixon vendetta a vicarious satisfaction of their own grievances. They provided shelter and food, information about target locations, warnings about approaching lawmen. The brothers moved through a corridor of support that stretched for hundreds of miles. The pursuit of justice took the brothers across state lines repeatedly as conspirators fled further and further from Wise County in desperate attempts to escape retribution. Samuel's tracking skills proved invaluable in following trails that others would have lost, while Thomas's ability to gather information made it possible to locate targets even in unfamiliar territory. The brothers worked as a team, each contributing his particular strengths to the common purpose, their coordination improving with each successful operation. The 16th victim was a man named James Morrison, who had been a jailer present during old Zeke's imprisonment. He had fled to Tennessee after the hanging, taking a new name and starting a new life, confident that no one would connect him to the events in Wise County. But Thomas Dixon had spent weeks tracking him, following a trail of information that led from one contact to another until Morrison's location was confirmed. He died in his bed in a boarding house in Knoxville, his throat cut in the same manner as the judges who had condemned Zeke to death. The 17th was killed in Kentucky, the 18th in North Carolina, the 19th back in Virginia itself. Each killing required travel and planning, patience and precision, resources that the brothers somehow managed to maintain despite the enormous pressure they were under. They had become ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will, leaving only bodies and notes to mark their passing. The authorities who hunted them found themselves constantly one step behind, arriving at locations the brothers had already left, interviewing witnesses who had seen nothing or who refused to speak. The 20th and final killing came in February 1897, more than a year after old Zeke's hanging. The target was a man named Robert Blackwood, the sheriff's brother, who had helped organize the posse that arrested Zeke and who had been present at the hanging itself. He had believed himself forgotten, too minor a figure to warrant the brothers' attention, and this belief had made him careless. He died in his own barn, surrounded by the animals he had been tending, shot through the heart from a distance of less than 10 feet. The note left with his body completed the count. Justice for Ezekiel Dixon, 20 of 20. It is finished. The vendetta had been fulfilled. Every conspirator accounted for. Every man who had participated in old Zeke's murder punished with death. The Dixon brothers had spent 14 months hunting their enemies across 5 states, had killed 20 men in revenge for one, had demonstrated a capacity for sustained and systematic violence that few families in American history could match. And when it was over, they simply stopped, the rage that had driven them finally exhausted, the debt to their father finally paid. The years that followed the vendetta's conclusion were surprisingly peaceful for the Dixon brothers. The state of Virginia, embarrassed by its failure to capture them and reluctant to admit how thoroughly its institutions had been corrupted by Harrison Crawford, quietly dropped all charges against the brothers in 1899. The official explanation cited lack of evidence, though everyone understood the real reason. Prosecuting the Dixons would require a public airing of the conspiracy that had led to their father's murder, and no one in Richmond wanted that kind of scrutiny. The decision to drop charges was controversial in some quarters, with editorial writers in Richmond and Washington condemning what they saw as the state's surrender to outlaws. But in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, the decision was welcomed as a belated acknowledgement that the Dixons had been in the right all along. The corrupt officials who had murdered old Zeke had paid for their crimes, and the system that should have punished them instead chose to pretend that nothing had happened. It was not justice in any formal sense, but it was perhaps the best outcome that could be expected under the circumstances. The brothers returned to the homestead that had been the center of their lives and began the slow work of rebuilding what the vendetta had disrupted. The fields that had lain fallow during the months of killing were plowed and planted again. The livestock that had scattered during Crawford's attack were rounded up and returned to their pastures. The buildings that had been damaged in the battle were repaired or replaced. Life resumed its seasonal rhythms, marked by the eternal cycle of planting and harvest, birth and death. The community received the brothers back with a respect that bordered on reverence. Men who had known old Zeke came to the homestead to pay their respects to his memory and to acknowledge what his sons had done to avenge him. Young people who had only heard stories about the vendetta sought out the brothers to hear first-hand accounts of events that were already becoming legend. The Dixon family, which had been one respected family among many before the tragedy, emerged from it as something approaching local royalty. The brothers returned to their lives with a caution that gradually faded as years passed without consequence. Elijah married late at the age of 42 and fathered 3 children who grew up knowing their father's reputation but rarely hearing him speak of it. Isaac never married, preferring a solitary life that kept him close to the homestead where he had been born. Thomas became something of a local celebrity, his charm and sociability making him popular despite his past, and he was elected to the County Board of Supervisors in 1910. William and Samuel raised families of their own, their children and grandchildren spreading throughout the region. The Dixon homestead remained in family hands through the 20th century, though each generation seemed to produce fewer children than the one before. The 1,000 acres that old Zeke had accumulated were gradually sold off to pay debts and taxes, until only the hollow itself remained, still occupied by Dixon descendants who maintained the family cemetery where old Zeke and his wife and his sons eventually came to rest. The main cabin was preserved as a kind of shrine, its walls still bearing the marks of the bullets that had been fired when Crawford's men attacked. The story of the Dixon brothers passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about them, ballads that celebrated their loyalty to their father and mourned the blood that had been spilled. Some portrayed them as heroes who had defended family honor against the corrupt forces of greed and power. Others painted them as murderers who had killed far more men than justice could possibly require. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Dixon story varied widely in their approach and their message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Crawford's arrival and ending with the 20th killing. Others focused on particular moments, dramatizing the hanging of old Zeke or the Battle of Dixon Hollow or the long hunt for the final conspirators. The melodies were simple and haunting, the kind that lodge in memory and refuse to leave, carrying the story across generations and across the mountains themselves. The most famous of these songs, known as the Dixon Boys, was composed in 1898 by a blind musician named William Stone, who had known the family personally. Stone had lost his sight in a mining accident years before, but he had gained a reputation as a composer and singer whose songs captured the spirit of mountain life better than anyone else of his generation. His song about the Dixon brothers has been recorded by dozens of artists over the past century and remains a standard in the Appalachian folk repertoire. Historians who have studied the Dixon case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of class conflict, with the wealthy industrialist Crawford representing the forces of capitalism, and the Dixon family representing the traditional mountain communities that stood in capitalism's way. Others have focused on the failure of legal institutions to protect the innocent, seeing in old Zeke's trial and execution a warning about what happens when courts become tools of the powerful rather than instruments of justice. The graves of the Dixon family dead lie together in the small cemetery overlooking the hollow where they built their legacy. Old Zeke rests there beside his wife Mary, and one by one his sons came to join them as the decades passed. Elijah died in 1932, Isaac in 1929, Thomas in 1941, William in 1937, and Samuel, the youngest, in 1945. Their headstones bear only their names and dates, giving no indication of the bloody history that connects them. But everyone who visits the cemetery knows the story, knows what these men did and why they did it. You see, what the Dixon brothers did cannot be justified by any conventional moral framework, cannot be excused or explained away or fitted neatly into categories of right and wrong. They killed 20 men, some of whom bore heavy responsibility for their father's murder, and some of whom played only minor roles in the conspiracy. They terrorized an entire region for more than a year, creating widows and orphans who suffered just as they had suffered. The violence they committed was disproportionate by any reasonable measure, extending far beyond what even the most generous interpretation of justice could require. And yet, their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of madness and murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that violence is wrong. They were sons who watched their father hanged on false charges by a corrupt system that offered no legitimate recourse. The courts that should have protected the innocent had been purchased by those with money and power. The law enforcement officials who should have upheld justice had become instruments of oppression. What response could a society expect from men so completely betrayed by every institution designed to provide protection and recourse? Their story challenges us to consider what we ourselves might do in similar circumstances, what any children might do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate justice. It offers no comfortable conclusions, no clean moral lessons, only the raw fact of human capacity for both cruelty and consequence. The conspirators who murdered old Zeke never imagined that their action would result in 20 deaths and the destruction of everything they had built. The Dixon brothers never imagined that their lives would be defined by violence when they rode to Big Stone Gap on that November morning. All of them were swept up in forces larger than themselves. The specific circumstances that produced the Dixon tragedy have changed in the decades since their vendetta ended. The coal barons who once dominated southwestern Virginia have largely departed, their power broken by unions and regulations and the decline of the industry itself. The political machines that controlled county governments have been reformed, at least partially, by changes in law and shifts in public expectation. The old mountain communities have been transformed by roads and electricity and television, their isolation broken by forces of modernization that once seemed so distant. But the underlying dynamics that created the Dixon conflict have not disappeared entirely. Wealthy and powerful interests still sometimes use their influence to corrupt legal institutions. Courts still sometimes fail to protect the innocent against those with resources to manipulate the system. Communities still sometimes find themselves facing injustices for which no legitimate remedy exists. The story of the Dixon brothers serves as a reminder of what can happen when these dynamics are allowed to continue unchecked, when the gap between justice as it should be and justice as it is becomes too wide for people to accept. The descendants of the Dixon family still live in those Virginia hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and burden. Some have embraced the family legacy, researching the history and preserving the stories for future generations. Others have tried to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the violence that made their ancestors famous. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred more than a century ago, a vendetta that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. The hollow where the Dixon homestead once stood remains in family hands to this day, though the original cabin has long since collapsed into ruin. The foundation stones are still visible if you know where to look, and the spring that provided water to 4 generations of Dixons still flows cold and clear. The cemetery on the hill is maintained by descendants who make the annual pilgrimage to clear brush and replace flowers and pay their respects to the men who lie beneath those simple stones. The site of the Battle of Dixon Hollow is overgrown now, the positions where men fought and died reclaimed by the forest that covers everything in these mountains eventually. But traces of the battle can still be found by those who know what to look for. Spent cartridge cases turn up occasionally, brass and copper artifacts of the violent day when 50 men entered the hollow and fewer than 15 left alive. Stone walls that the Dixons built as fighting positions still stand in places, their purpose forgotten by most, but remembered by those who preserve the family history. The graves of Crawford's dead were never properly marked, their families too ashamed or too afraid to claim them. Some were buried in the hollow itself, in unmarked graves that have long since been forgotten. Others were transported out of the county and interred in family plots that make no mention of how they died or where. The battle that killed them has been erased from official records, but it lives on in the memory of mountain communities that understand what happened and why. The mountains themselves remain ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear. The trees still change color each autumn. The hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. The mountains of Wise County remain today much as they were in 1895, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear. The trees still change color each autumn. The hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. The county seat has grown into a small city, but the backcountry remains remote and difficult to access. Those who live there still tell stories about the Dixon Brothers, about the vendetta and its consequences, about what happens when men push other men too far. The lessons of that bloody year have not been forgotten, passed down from generation to generation, in stories and songs that keep the memory alive. The story of the Dixon Brothers endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of filial loyalty and what that loyalty becomes when it is tested beyond all reasonable limits. It is the story of corruption and its consequences, of systems that fail the people they are supposed to serve and people who respond to that failure in the most terrible ways possible. It is the story of vengeance and its terrible costs, both to those who suffer it and to those who inflict it. It is finally a story without heroes or villains, only humans caught in circumstances that reveal both the best and worst of what we are capable of becoming. The mountains witnessed it all, and the mountains remember, keeping their eternal vigil over the valleys and hollows below. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where the Dixon brothers stood, to see the hollow they defended, and the cemetery where they rest beside their father? Would you walk the paths they walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow itself is difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The mountains keep their secrets close, holding the memory of the Dixon brothers, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Wise County in 1895, as long as sons love their fathers with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find ways to respond. They are gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hollow they loved, but what they did and what was done to their father echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Dixon brothers, who slaughtered 20 lawmen after they hanged their father in front of the town on false charges manufactured by a corrupt coal baron. A story of love and loss, of corruption and vengeance, of the limits of human endurance and what happens when those limits are exceeded. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all.